So this film starts with Mr. Brooks, aka Kevin Costner, being awarded the Portland Man of the Year award. So right away you can kind of tell that he's successful, he has a happy wife, sweet daughter in college, nothing seems to be off about him. And pretty quickly into the movie you meet his alternate identity, whose name is Marshall, as well as the other characters that kind of come into play throughout this movie.
Okay, so a few of the most prominent psychological disorders depicted in the film were dissociative identity disorder, in which Mr. Brooks had a split personality, and we would see him often arguing with himself through his alternate personality, Mr. Marshall. We also saw antisocial personality disorder, as he would repeatedly violate the rights of others through intruding on their privacy and other inappropriate behaviors. But he also possessed a superficial charm and high levels of intelligence while experiencing very little anxiety in threatening situations. We also saw voyeurism throughout the film in the other character, Mr. Smith, as he would spy on his neighbors and take pictures while the couple across the street engaged in sexual activities.
So this movie does a pretty good job of showing the fact that Mr. Brooks is clearly dissociative identity, kind of because they're so intertwined with each other. They are coexisting. When Mr. Brooks is around, Marshall then can be around. But he shows up as a very physical manifestation, as it says here, which isn't typically the case in most patients with this disorder, and that would be why it's sort of inaccurate, because in reality, Mr. Brooks wouldn't really be able to control the two, and that is true in this case, but it wouldn't come up as a separate person. It would be within him, and when one took over, the other would kind of be defunct, in a sense. So because he has basically an imaginary friend that follows him around all the time, it almost would appear that he could be schizophrenic or out of touch with reality in that way, but because he is so present and aware of what's going on around him, it seems a very clear case of dissociative identity disorder.
Okay, so it also did a pretty good job of portraying antisocial personality disorder. Some of the accuracies we saw were in some of the basic factors, which was the interpersonal factor, as he possessed that superficial charm and incredible success as he was voted Man of the Year, and he was able to socially interact with people pretty successfully. However, he also displayed some antisocial tendencies through his poor behavioral control and antisocial behavior we saw, as he would violate the rights of others and spy on people. Some of the inaccuracies we noticed were he didn't really meet the affective factor, because he did accept responsibility and show some remorse and empathy for his actions, as well as a desire to stop his murderous behaviors, but at the same time, he kept on killing. The lifestyle factor we were sort of in between of, as he had a lack of goals and acted on his impulses in a calculative way, so it wasn't super uncontrolled, but it still was an impulse. Also, many of the symptoms of anti-personality disorder were attributed to Mr. Marshall rather than Mr. Brooks himself, as he was portrayed as relatively innocent, which we saw as he would argue with his alter ego throughout the movie.
So Mr. Smith is a character in the movie that Mr. Brooks meets early on, right after we see him take his first two victims, and he basically has photo proof that it was him that did it, and he blackmails him into sort of making him his accomplice, because he too is interested in taking part in killing and basically snooping on people. So in this case, it looks like he's a voyeurist or someone that experiences paraphilia, in that he enjoys watching some other people engage in sexual acts, and also kind of enjoys seeing other people in pain, which is one of the more common, I think, things that people think of when they hear the word voyeurist. As it says here, the neighbors mentioned in this movie did enjoy having other people see them. As it would seem, they like to do their stuff with the windows open, so kind of an easy target for snoopers, like Mr. Smith in this case. And the only thing that maybe would not support this theory fully is that there's no evidence that Mr. Smith has the inability to obtain sexual pleasure in other ways. It doesn't really look, from the way the movie kind of poses things, that he has a whole lot of friends or much of a sex life going on, so one would kind of be led to believe that he only gets enjoyment from those sort of things.
So as far as the influence of the depiction of this film went, the two largest points of influence as far as the general public goes, which we noticed, were on the perception of antisocial personality disorder and dissociative identity, and the inaccuracies in these portrayals, as they seem to encourage the common misconception of all individuals with antisocial personality disorder being criminals and murderers, which is not accurate. And additionally, the embodiment of Mr. Marshall in the displayment of dissociative identity disorder could cause the public to develop a false understanding of what this disorder really is, because he was literally manifesting himself, which is obviously what dissociative identity disorder is.
Of course, we all know that these are not made by psychologists or clinicians or any kind of mental health professionals. It is purely for entertainment. So, of course, the things that they might have glossed over or embellished, such as Mr. Brooks's, physical extra personality that shows up as a person in the movie, that's kind of more for our own benefit. The viewers kind of get to see that rather than, getting in on his mental thoughts via a narrator or something less clear and visual. That being said, it didn't go so far off the point that it was unclear what psychological disorders were trying to be represented, or in a way that I thought was disrespectful to people suffering from that disorder. Of course, you don't want a movie made about you as a serial killer, right? Because that adds to the stereotype of people with mental illnesses are bad or criminals, specifically something like dissociative personality disorder. So I think that they really humanized him in this story, which is a huge kind of component of the sociopolitical responsibility Hollywood holds. But, of course, there were some details that were maybe glossed over or elaborated on in order to make it a little more entertaining.